So, I have ADHD. This means that I tend to jump right into things without properly planning anything and just expect things to turn out great. Sometimes this works, other times it doesn't, and sometimes this leads me to starting another project on top of the project that I was already working on. So, when I announced in an earlier video that I was teaching myself how to animate, I was really saying that I'm fucking around and finding out with animation. I had some, heavy emphasis on some, training in animation. I took 2 courses of one of those online 3D animation trade school things that I keep forgetting the name of before flunking out after the second course because life was just not going my way at that point in time. All that to say, I knew enough of the basics to create my rough draft and outline for the animation I'm working on for my OC, Ezra. It wasn't until I got to the cleanup sketches that I realized I have no idea what Ezra really looks like. Sure, I had drawings of Ezra and a whole ass VTuber model design for Ezra, but I didn't have a set in stone design specifically for animation. So that's what this video is about. Ezra is the god of creation, magic, and destruction from my original universe, Somniumverse. He is mostly inspired by Avatar The Last Airbender, Dragon Age, Christian mythology, and my experience with living with borderline personality disorder. He is a species I call Daedran from the country of Daedra, a half-elf, half-dragon in a single body. On top of that, he is also given the designation of Seraphim. In this world, there is the divine light, which is the equivalent of the Christian God. Being a seraphim is to be considered as a second or third to the divine light. With his father also being the Emperor of Daedra and the All-Father God to the seraphims, you could say Ezra is, in general, under a lot of pressure to be perfect. The long explanation of Ezra's story is that he was just born different. First, being born a girl after a long line of boys and men. Ezra's birth was seen as a sign that the times of conflict were ending and a time of peace was coming. Second, being born with a destiny and prophecy over his head. Having these things in this world was seen as bad luck and taking away a free will. However, with Ezra being born a girl, everybody mistakenly thought the prophecy wasn't even about him, thus ensuring that it would indeed come true. Third, and arguably most importantly, Ezra was born a sorcerer, which is a mage who has magical abilities over all the elements in the universe. Sorcerers are rare, and with the last famously known sorcerer using his magic to commit mass genocide, they are feared. Ezra was basically controlled and abused into never tapping into his full potential of power. So all that magical energy built up in his body like a ticking time bomb, ready for a spark to unleash it. Ezra was also unfortunately a prodigy, mastering magical techniques that were either forgotten of or outlawed, changing sex being one of them. Ezra publicly demonstrated his mastery of blood magic, or transformation magic, and made himself look male, not knowing that it was outlawed magic. By doing this, he publicly embarrassed his father, which made the subtle covert abuse into more obvious physical forms of abuse. Ezra ended up developing the equivalent of borderline personality disorder. Now, anytime his body feels threatened or emotionally triggered, all that magical pent-up energy unleashes itself destructively. His personality switches into a devilish and impulsive caricature of himself, ready to unleash hell upon his opponents. The most devastating example being when, in a confrontation and battle to the death against his father, Ezra ended up destroying his homeworld. The destruction of Daedra earned him the title of God of Destruction, but depending on who you ask, some people who know his true story call him the God of Power instead, claiming that if he was never abused or taught to fear his power, he would be a god powerful enough to rival the divine light itself. The short explanation of Ezra is to think of Aang, Zuko, Azula, and Korra all wrapped up into one character, and when in the Avatar state, Aang becomes Azula and pretends to enjoy it, and sometimes he even does enjoy it. Ezra was a version of my persona I used to represent myself online, and thus is a self-insert character. He is, at his core, a character I made up to help me cope with my BPD. Sometimes when I analyze Ezra, I end up finding some new discovery about my own mental health. Ezra had many names, and just like me, is trans and queer. I first drew him as a teenage elf girl with a more masculine or tomboy look. Anytime I drew Ezra, I was really trying to draw myself. I guess I thought that by drawing myself and my BPD as a cool, powerful character, I would end up loving myself. This was not the case, unfortunately. But hey, I do have one hell of a cool character, so I do call it a win. The key characteristic of Ezra is that he has two forms, the magical form and his destructive split personality form. I draw and write him like this because it is the best way for me to articulate what my experience with BPD is. Somewhere between these two forms is the real Ezra, his sense of self completely destroyed by his need to be perfect and his need for safety. His perfect side is more pink themed, and his destructive side is blue. The blue form is the one I'm focusing on in this video, as it's the one I focus on in my art. It's easier to draw Ezra's blue form just because I have so many references to pull from. The most important details of this form is the white hair, symbolizing his relationship to death, blue dragon eyes, horns, and tail, symbolizing his Daedran Seraphim status, his blue outfit representing his masculinity, as well as the status of being the Emperor's son, and most importantly, his scarred black magical vein arms, representing how repressed his magical abilities are and how much it hurts him. Not so fun fact you might not have known, studies show that people with borderline personality disorder register their emotions the same way they register physical pain in their bodies. This is also represented by the scarred arms and his exaggerated facial expressions that you'll see later on in this video. If you're interested, I've listed an article and a YouTube video that go more into depth into BPD in case you don't know about BPD or want to learn more. Overall, Ezra as a character is a tool I use to tell my story of my life and what I've been through a fantastical and exaggerated version of myself. I believe this is called narrative therapy, but hey, I'm not a specialist, what the hell do I know? My favorite pieces of Ezra I've done is this one, where I drew him as a villain. It inspired me to delve deeper into his split side. And this one, the time I used him as my VTuber model. I feel like these two pieces really represented what I wanted Ezra to be as a character. And while I'm not sticking with the VTuber model right now, I will definitely use it when I get to the arc in Ezra's story where he's living on Earth. Ezra used to be called the God of Reality, but when I entered the VTuber sphere, there was this purple guy calling himself that, so I didn't want it to look like I was copying him. Even though I'd be happy to argue I came up with the idea first, but hey, you know, he beat me to it. Fair is fair, and I'm not a sore loser. Not at all. Anyways, it forced me to re-examine Ezra as a character, and I discovered that him being the god of creation, magic, and destruction was far better suited to his character after all. The very first thing I did was gather all the pictures and reference photos I had of Ezra and compile them into one document for organization. Since this video was inspired by sketches of Shay, I also decided to use Milanote, and holy cow is it convenient. Hashtag this is not an ad. I organized all the different versions of Ezra as you can see here and realized I was going to need multiple designs of the same character. Then I made another board for the blue form, compiling the photos and references I wanted to use for that, along with the inspirations for the character. I used to be embarrassed that I was so obviously inspired by Avatar The Last Airbender growing up, but now I'm not, and that's called growth. Nightcrawler was also a huge inspiration for the character, specifically in his fighting style and overall devilish demeanor. The goal for this character sheet was to focus less on perfection and more on making Ezra feel believable. I decided to do a turnaround sheet after finishing the character sheet. I wanted to give off the vibe and the feeling of Ezra rather than the technical detail. I wanted to really emphasize his dragon aspects, overwhelming power, and persona the most, so that is what I focused on. This is where the actual designing process begins. I first wanted to do an initial design, basically just draw what I imagined in my head on the canvas, really trying to focus on the overall shapes and color values I wanted to use. I started out with a basic standing pose without any real personality, just so I could focus on what I wanted the character to look like. In my first attempt on his outfit, I was still in love with the VTuber model I made, so I wanted to heavily reference it, especially with the hoodie. But I just couldn't make it work and look good with the overall vibe, so I ended up not using it. I kinda made the first attempt more slutty than I initially intended. Nothing wrong with showing skin or anything, but because this was more a combat-focused character, I didn't feel like the crop top would be appropriate for the overall design. I still kept a skin-tight shirt though, cause it's basically a staple of the character at this point. The second and third attempt at his outfit, I heavily referenced D&D monk character designs I found on Pinterest, but I must have subconsciously took the words monk and outfit and connected it to Dragon Ball Z, cause that's what they basically ended up looking like. No shade, but I'm honestly not a big Dragon Ball Z fan, and this was most definitely not what I was going for. You'll also notice I attempted to add some sort of dragon scales to the arms, but I ended up dropping this idea as well, as it would take away from the scarred arms. The fourth attempt was the closest I got to what I was aiming for, but as I continue, you'll notice something. See, the reason why this design was doing it for me was because I had seen this design somewhere else. Take a moment to guess where on earth I copied this design from. Go on, guess. If you guessed Korra, you would be correct. I basically recreated her outfit on a masculine body. The fifth attempt, I basically said fuck it and just rolled with the inspiration. I mean, hey, the character design worked for Korra well enough, right? I just made sure that it was different enough not to be labeled as a copycat, if you, Okay, yeah, no, that wasn't that funny. Anyways, the face was easier to do, and I was able to reference the VTuber model a lot more, especially in the face makeup. I ended up completely stealing the black face mask makeup as well, just to give the eyes more contrast and pop. When doing the head, I was mostly focused on getting the hair right. The horns made it difficult for me to place where I want the hair to fall, and I always want the hair to specifically part behind the left horn and swoop over to the right. When I was finally satisfied with my initial idea, I moved on to solidifying it. Putting Ezra in a simple standing pose, I focused on putting all the elements of the character together for one design. Honestly, the hardest part of this particular pose was these motherfucking hands, I swear to God. I know I need to go back and do some studies on these shits, but for the life of me, I cannot convince myself to engage with hands and feet more than I already do. What's the opposite of a foot fetish? I don't know what it's called, but I have that. Here, you now see me placing my values. I wanted this character to be heavily contrasting, especially in places where I was planning on placing some glowing blue colors and black and dark blue colors. After that, I went back over all of that with the color palette I used for the VTuber model. The color palette was another thing about Ezra that was always consistent: white, blue, black, and silver. Fun fact though, the black color is really just a deep, dark blue. I made it so that I could easily differentiate between the clothing and the scarred arms, as well as the horns and tail. When I got to shading the skin, I initially thought that maybe using my personal skin tone, which is more yellowish brown rather than red, but honestly, I feel like the reddish brown works a lot better with the blue. I don't know what the technical term for this is, but I hope you get my point. I wanted to do two more poses for this sheet, one that showed off his combat style more and one that was just kinda aura and vibes. I felt like a Nightcrawler pose was the best to reference for the combat one, since Ezra uses a lot of teleportation and fire magic in his style. And for the aura one, I just straight up copied a similar pose from Avatar: The Last Airbender, but made it look more intimidating. The fire dragon wings, I feel like not only give off the illusion of floating in the air, but also adds to the overall raw power feeling I wanted Ezra to have. I threw in a side view portrait of Ezra in the corner of the sheet just so I had his face at a different angle, and then went to work on his facial expressions. The challenge with these was I had to exaggerate all of them, while making sure that they were still proportionate, made sense, and didn't look silly. BPD is a disorder with intense emotions being the baseline at all times. So it was so important to me that the viewer not only recognize the emotions coming from Ezra, but also feel them. it was also important to me to show just how expressive Ezra really was. When he emotes, his entire body emotes with him. The only time you really see him still is when he's anxious and when he feels nothing. I also exaggerated these ones as well, but I think it comes across better in the contempt facial expression. The almost symmetrical and completely still face really sells it. I have to say, my favorite ones to draw were the manic facial expressions as well as the anger one. The manic one looks unhinged, and the anger one looks exactly the way I imagined it in my head. You see me do some final touches on the overall sheet, and then it's done. Overall, I love the design. Looking at it now, there are some things I would change. First, I think I'll go back and change the color of the foot wraps to either match the shirt or the pants. I feel like it would make Ezra look taller like I wanted. I'd probably also change the center fabric in the middle as well. The color break it provides is nice, and it does add to the overall monk look, but I just honestly don't like it. For the next character sheet, I'll probably add another combat pose too, just for some variation, along with the turnaround. I'd give this project an 8 out of 10. For my first character sheet, seeing only some minor flaws and fixes makes me really happy. I posted the final render on my ArtStation, Blue Sky, Twitter, and Tumblr, which is all linked below, so you should go and follow me. Thank you so much for watching, I really appreciate it. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload from me. Another way you can support me is by commissioning me over on VGen for some character art. Maybe I can create a reference sheet for your character too, you know? Links to everything will be in the description and the pinned comment below. I hope you have a great morning, afternoon, and or evening, and I will see you guys next time. Bye for now.